It's August 12, 1908, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
In the opening years of the 20th century, cars really weren't all that practical. They were more like a high-maintenance, fragile plaything for the ultra-wealthy. However, the American industrialist Henry Ford came along and changed all that today in history in 1908 when he constructed a cheap, reliable car that really transformed the industry, the Model T.
Yeah, and it takes its name from the alphabetical order that was applied to successive Ford models. So this was by far his first foray into automobiles. The first had, unsurprisingly, been the Model A, which went into production in 1903, so only 5 years earlier. And like most automobiles at the time, that had looked very much like a horseless carriage. And over the subsequent models, the shape would evolve into something more car-like, and the price would get closer to something that would be attainable for the middle-class consumer, although not every model actually made it to market. What would set the Model T apart from its predecessors was the assembly line, the production model which Ford would become famous for. But on this day in history, that when that first Model T was made, that was not yet in place. That would come several years later. And these first Model Ts were made broadly in the same way as previous Ford models and existing competitor models. It was built by hand by a team of skilled workers who would go between 84 separate zones assembling it.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, this is one of the few things that we've covered on this show where I'm like, I know this already, and it's because I was taught it when I was like 7. We are still taught at school that the Ford Model T was the revolutionary vehicle that got the world driving, and the reason for that was because of the assembly line. So it is quite interesting to see that it was years as it evolved that process came about, not on this day, the initial concept. And actually, I get the impression that if Henry Ford's son, it's a bit like our episode on Thomas Cook where we're talking about having a more capitalist child, if Henry Ford's son hadn't been like, Dad, we should probably try and evolve this a bit, he'd have carried on making this car forever. And that's because the initial dream was there on this day. The assembly line wasn't, but the concept of there's a whole new, basically lower middle class audience that have never driven before and have never had the idea that they might drive before because they either live in the country where they use horses and could never imagine travelling those kind of distances, or they live in the city where they walk and cycle and have no need for vehicles. And I'm going to sell them this dream. That was there on this day.
And it was made out of vanadium steel, which was this high-strength, lightweight alloy that Ford had actually seen on a European racing car's wreck. And that made the Model T incredibly tough. It made it capable of taking a really brutal beating from the roads around early America, which, after all, were deeply rutted and quite muddy. And so they needed to have like a quite durable machine to be able to get along them. It was powered by a very simple 20-horsepower four-cylinder engine that could run on either gasoline, kerosene, or ethanol, and it could reach a top speed of about 45 miles per hour. And that must have been quite seductive in itself, because up until then, if you weren't in a car, you probably weren't thinking of going much faster than a horse could go. Plus, then, the price point. It was under $850. So immediately, within kind of touching distance.
Yeah, and for most Americans until now, they had been living in essentially what was a motorless world. If you lived in a town or a city, you might see a few bumbling down the street, but it really wouldn't be part of your life. The Model T, for those people, was the car, especially because nowadays, even a slight tweak to a design tends to get it slapped with a brand new name, but that wasn't really a thing in the early auto industry. So while you probably have a mental picture of what a Model T looks like, the name was actually used to refer to a whole range of body styles that was sort of constructed along similar lines, but externally were quite different. And that sort of variance and affordability and durability had no rival on the market. So the Model T could be adapted for all kinds of uses. It was used as a fire engine, it was used as an ambulance, it was used by the US military, and in agriculture it fulfilled a function a bit like when we talked about Jeeps.
Yeah.
It kind of functioned like the Jeep would 40 years later. It was hard-wearing enough that it could travel across farm terrain. It would kind of almost be an ATV, but it also, you could have machinery hooked up to its engine to use it as a power source itself in unelectrified rural areas.
So cool. Have you seen the photos?
No. Yes.
There's a photo of like some dude in 1920 putting like a pulley and a leather drive belt to it to turn it into a mini power plant on his farm. There's then another shot of like the tractor kit that you could put on it, moving a whole load of hay down the street, and you're just like, amazing. Wow, I see this as just like an old-timey kind of wedding car, but it was being used for like hard use on farms.
Yeah. Well, and there was like, as you were alluding to, there was like this thriving hack industry devoted to helping people do weird things to their Model T. So yes, it could be modified into a tractor. There were very popular best-selling kits to help farmers do just that. And in colder climates, it could be fitted with skis on the front wheels and tracks on the back wheels to act as a sort of rudimentary skidoo. They were called snow flyers. And for the more adventurous, you could strip out the engine and retrofit it into a motorboat. And for the more death-seeking, you could even use it to power a homemade aeroplane.
Wow. And yet it was such a gamble, and the financial backers behind Ford were really horrified by the idea that what he was proposing to launch was an affordable car rather than a luxury vehicle, which had been what every previous model had aspired to. But Ford rammed it through, and, you know, really the big change was the way that he changed his purpose-built Highland Park plant to be not just a place where cars were constructed, but the world's first moving assembly line for cars. Like, instead of workers moving around a stationary vehicle, the chassis was pulled down a line by a conveyor chain, and then workers performed their single, like, repetitive, surely mind-numbing task as the chassis passed by them. And that was the thing that then dropped the production time for a car from like 12 hours to just 93 minutes per car. Like, the cost of the car went from $850 down to $300 as the production processes improved. And that made it even more accessible.
It's worth just lingering on that price. It actually got down as low as $260.
Wow.
And that is equivalent now to less than $4,000 in modern money. So imagine that, getting a brand new Ford for $4,000 now.
Yeah.
That's what people were doing in 1920-ish. That's why this was so revolutionary. He didn't invent the assembly line. He just perfected it for cars. It had been done with watchmaking, clockmaking, gun making, sewing machines, meat processors. But as you say, this is kind of mind-numbing work and hard manual work repetitively. And he had a solution for that as well, which was, okay, I'll pay double then. So I've made the work doubly as tedious, but I'm going to pay you twice as much for doing it. Which did two things. One was it kept his workforce being trained up and, you know, being expert at what they were doing and the best in the world. But the other was it created a middle class out of his working class labourers who then themselves bought the car because they could afford it. So you had a customer base there. And it wasn't as if with each tweak to the assembly line he was making the car better. He was just making it more affordable and more efficient. One of the things, for example, they did in 1914 is eliminate all colours apart from black. So when they launched it, you could buy lots of colours. And then he said in 1914, no, we could do this cheaper if we just have black, because the Japanning process, which allowed the paint to dry quickly, only worked with black paint. So he's like, right, we do one colour, it's black. You know, so it's not as if customers got a better range, but they got a better deal.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, 1914 was sort of a key point to make that decision, because Highland Park had switched to the moving assembly line the previous year. Well, obviously, the time it took paint to dry suddenly took on a lot more importance. But also, you're having the outbreak of war in Europe, and that obviously raised the cost of doing business for lots of industries. And so having a variety of paint finishes probably seemed like, you know, a bit of a luxury in that era too. So it was the perfect time to switch. And later on, you know, Ford himself attributes the quote to him saying it could be in any colour so long as it's black. And he kind of made it sound like that was his principle from the beginning. Whereas, as you said, initially you could have it in dark blue, green, red, grey, whatever you wanted, basically. I mean, Ford wasn't even the first car manufacturer to use assembly line principles. The Olds company, who made the Oldsmobile, had been using them since 1901. But the idea for the moving assembly line was brought to Ford's attention by an engineer at the company called William Clan. He had taught a slaughterhouse in Chicago. I don't know if he had taught it to get ideas or whether he just liked slaughterhouses, not sure. But
it's a worthwhile experience for anyone, isn't it? I always say, at some point in your life, tour a slaughterhouse. Who knows what ideas you can apply to your sector?
He was intrigued by what they called the disassembly line. They were disassembling carcasses and butchering them down into meat via a series of moving overhead lines. You know, if you could picture a slaughterhouse, they're like coming along on hooks.
Yes,
and he
thank
thought
you for that.
We could do this with a car. But as you mentioned, obviously, the problem with this is that It means that the worker is no longer moving. It means the worker is no longer really a skilled operative. It's unskilled labour. And unskilled labour has a high turnover. And so, indeed, he announced that pay for assemblers would double in 1914. You had to work there for 3 years before you got this. But it was doubling from $2.40 a day, which was already a decent salary at the time for unskilled work, to $5. And that was a wage that other factories could not compete with at all. And that ensured those high retention rates that he needed.
By 1927, the day that they finally stopped making the Model T, Ford had built over 15 million of the cars, and that is a production record that stood for many decades afterwards. And, you know, the legacy of all that construction isn't just that loads of cars went on the road, but it's the thing that you will see anytime you look out your window. Like, it's the reason that governments began paving millions of miles of roads. It sparked the rise of the suburbs, changed how, like, food was brought to market. So it's like this massive turning point, not only in the way that cities looked and are constructed, but also the way that we interact with the physical environment by getting in a car and going exactly where we want.
Yeah, it's a good point. Now I know he's responsible for the suburbs, I'm a lot less enthusiastic about him.
Wait till I tell you about his anti-Semitism.
Tomorrow.
The Berlin police issued him an ID card that included the words former king of Albania, and the title is on his tombstone.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.